Home genetic tests like 23andMe and Ancestry.com have become very popular, and people are trying to understand what their test results mean. But sometimes these lines of inquiry have stirred up a lot of confusion. You may have heard it said that every European is descended from Charlemagne, or that if we go back just a few generations further, then, well, everyone's descended from everyone. But is this right? If it is right, how is it possible, and what does it really mean? My name is Dan, and I'll be your host today while we unpack some features of genetics. Before we start, let me make it clear I am not a geneticist. I am an educator, a sometimes writer, and a former high-tech business analyst and former lecturer in W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. This lesson is not going to be concerned with the anatomy or physiology of genetics. Genetics has a mathematical and probabilistic component to it, and it may not surprise you that geneticists usually learn probability from mathematicians, not from each other. Our objective with this lesson will be to use easy, friendly, relatable illustrations to animate how the math works that underlines genetic ancestry, and by doing so, shed light on where the genes that make you up come from. While we demystify some of the evocative claims that are often thrown around when people talk about genetics. To do this, here and throughout, we will use the relatable analogy of a deck of playing cards. We believe that if you can understand playing cards, you can understand genetics. Now, it's going to be necessary that we get familiar with just a few big words. The human genome is a complete set of nucleic acids, which are themselves coded as 23 chromosome pairs. Now, I want you to be clear that it is not necessary to have a biochemist's understanding of nucleic acids in order for anyone to proceed with this. All that you really need to understand is that the body and the body's cells use nucleic acids like a code or an alphabet, and specific ordered strings of nucleic acids operate just like a language, just like a code, so that they provide instructions to the body's cells on how to carry out their physiological activity. That is why it works perfectly well for us to abbreviate the 5 nucleic acids found in DNA and RNA to A, C, G, U, and T. And this is probably the only time you'll hear me say it, because we really don't need to know it to proceed, but those letters stand for adenosine, cytosine, guanosine, uridine, and thymidine. So let's break this down. Every person, every human being, every man, every woman is built from a genome composed of 23 chromosome pairs, or 46 individual chromosomes. Now, of course, you've heard that before, but let's have a look closely at what that really means. During reproduction, chromosomes unfold. While unfolded, they take on the appearance of a letter, and most of the time they look like the letter X, but sometimes they look like the letter Y. We'll have a look more closely at X and Y later. For now, we're just going to look closely at X because almost every chromosome is an X. That breaks down to 23 pairs, 46 individual chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. Naturally, genomes differ from one species to the next. While with people, we know that we have 23 pairs of 46 individual chromosomes. Cats have 19 pairs of 38 individual chromosomes. Dogs have 39 pairs of 78 individual chromosomes, and horses have 32 pairs of 64 individual chromosomes. Now, if we're looking for the most, then the real prize goes out to a bird called the kingfisher. Modest in size, exuberant in appearance, the kingfisher clocks in genomically at 66 chromosome pairs, or 132 individual chromosomes. Skipping steps is always tempting. The problem is sometimes skipping steps leaves you hanging. There are times when you stand to learn and understand a lot more if you just don't skip steps. That is why we will take a moment here to note that we are going to focus in this lesson on chromosomes. Chromosomes are not the same thing as genes. Chromosomes and genes are related to each other, but chromosomes are the foundation to understanding genes. Remember when we said earlier that chromosomes expose their X and Y patterns to us when they reproduce, which is when the double helices they are on decouple and unwind. But chromosomes do their work of making you when they're wound up in double helices inside your cell nuclei. When they're wound up like this, they match up hundreds to usually thousands of pairs of genes. As the chromosomes from your mom are paired to the chromosomes from your dad, the genes from your mom's chromosomes are paired up with the genes of your dad's chromosomes in one very long strand. We call these gene pairs, base pairs, and there are about 3 billion of these in the human genome. So did you get that? 3 billion. 3 billion is a lot more than 46, which is why we are going to start with something simpler, with the foundations, with 46 chromosomes, before we start trying to wrap our minds around 3 billion base pairs. There's a wonder here that's worth taking a moment to stop and think about before we move on. Your genome is composed of 3 billion genes from your mom, wrapped up tight and coiled together in perfect order with 3 billion genes from your dad. And those genes spell out a language that communicates the instructions to your cells that cause your cells to make you. And they are doing that right now. If uncoiled and rolled out so they spelled their language out side by side, these 3 billion base pairs would stretch almost 2 meters long, which is a little bit more than 2 yards. According to Riccardo Sabatini, if we converted the base pairs and their nucleic acids to regular font-sized letters and printed them letter by letter, page by page, these coded instructions for making you and keeping you operating would fill 175 books, or about 262,000 densely packed pages. So the wonders of genetics really are a lot like magic, and it's just about here that X's and Y's will no longer suit us. The magic of genetics comes from the ways that genetics and chromosomes mix, and what better way to illustrate magic than with a couple of decks of playing cards. What will differ about this genetic deck from the decks you use to play card games is that the genetic deck, like the human genome with its 46 chromosomes, will consist of 46 playing cards, which we will call chromosome cards from here onwards. Let's summarize. For our lesson, no 52 card deck. Each card represents a chromosome, and card pairs represent chromosome pairs. There are 46 cards in our deck, and those cards come together to encode you. So where it comes to your personal genome, it is composed of 23 pairs, 23 from your mom, 23 from your dad, making a total of 46 chromosomes in your genome. So the way this works is, you inherit 23 cards from your mom in the form of 23 chromosomes she passes on to you, and 23 cards from your dad in the form of 23 chromosomes he passes on to you. These chromosome cards pair up in your double helices, making a complete 46 card deck of chromosome cards that happen to be you. Remember, when your mom and your dad pass on chromosomes to you, they each have 46 to give, but only 23 makes it from each one of them to you. So your mom gives one half of her cards and holds back the other half. And your dad gives one half of his cards to you and he holds back the other half. Otherwise, if they both passed on 46 cards, that would make 92 cards in total. And we don't know what that looks like. So wait a minute, because that may have seemed a bit obvious, or even if it wasn't obvious, it was still kind of an easy lesson. But the ease may conceal something very important if you don't stop and think about it. In just one transition of a generation, from mother-father to son or daughter, there were 92 cards to pass on from the parents to the next generation. But a whopping 46 of those cards didn't make it. And if you have no brothers or sisters, then they won't ever make it. Something that is at once straightforward and kind of profound happens when genetic information doesn't make it to the next generation. We want to put this into focus and have a very close look at it so we understand what's happening. We'll do this by working backwards from your parents and taking earlier generations into account, starting with your grandparents. You have 4 grandparents: a maternal grandmother, a maternal grandfather, a paternal grandmother, and a paternal grandfather. Let's look at how these 4 people's genes cross the generations to make you. 23 chromosome cards come from your mom, 23 chromosome cards come from your dad. Now we've seen this already, but let's look a little bit more closely this time. Actual numbers will vary, and we are simplifying the relationship between chromosomes and genes to express this, but we may imagine that 11 of your mom's chromosome cards that made it to you came from her mom, and 12 of your mom's chromosome cards that made it to you came from her dad. Likewise, we may imagine that 12 of your dad's chromosome cards that made it to you came from his mom, and 11 of his chromosome cards that made it to you came from his dad. Again, actual numbers will vary. That means that to start with, there were 184 cards between 4 people. Of the 92 cards between each set of grandparents, 69 from each couple do not make it to you. Thereafter, of the 46 cards from your mother, 23 don't make it. Of the 46 cards from your father, 23 don't make it. After all is said and done, and we have you, 46 cards, there are a total of 138 cards between grandma and grandpa and grandma that don't make it. Let's summarize. Actual numbers will vary from one case to another, but we can say this. Your maternal grandma, she had 46 cards. Of them, you got 11. Maternal grandpa, well, he had 46 cards too. Of those, you got 12. Paternal grandma, she also had 46 cards, of which we're saying you got 12. And paternal grandpa, He had 46 cards, of which, well, you got 11. All right, what happens if we take this back another generation? When we do the same exercise with your second generation grandparents, we now have 8 people in the past who all passed chromosome cards into the future, their future. 4 great-grandparents on your mom's side and 4 great-grandparents on your dad's side. Between these 8 people, they had 368 chromosome cards. Out of these cards, 322 do not make it to the present. Only 46 of the original 368 survive into the present day to come together and make you. This is where we think it may be useful to introduce a concept, the cross-generational chromosome canon. When your grandparents and their grandparents and theirs had kids, they each fired a chromosome cannon into the future. Their cannons shot chromosomes into the future, their future. You could say in hopes that some would survive the generations to make a new person, namely, in this case, baby you. As we look to previous generations, the boom we hear from chromosomes cannons past gets fainter and fainter. The sound we hear from your parents, well, that's pretty loud. We already saw they contributed 23 cards each to give you 46. So 46 chromosomes survive the passage of one generation. But one generation further back, well, that sound is a bit fainter. Only about 11 to 12 chromosome cards from each of your grandparents survived 2 generations to reach you. One more generation back, and the sound is fainter still. Only 5 to 6 of the chromosome cards from each of your great-grandparents survive to reach you. By the time we get to the 4th generation, or what we could say is the 3rd generation of grandparents, then the signal from each person is beginning to get faint. Here, only 2 to 3 chromosome cards from each great-great-great-grandparent survived the journey through time, through the generations, to make it all the way to your genome. Turns out, the further back we go in time, the further forward our great-grandparents have to canon their chromosome cards out into the future, their future, to hit a target, so to speak, and make a new baby. To them, a new grandchild or great-grandchild. If we look at the chromosome cards that find their way into the future, that find a home in some great-grandchild's genome, we are missing a big part of the picture. So we have to look closely at the chromosome loss from one generation to the next in order to pinpoint a subtle and amazing facet of ancestral genetics. Let's do that. Let's look closely at what happens when we go back 4 generations to the parents of your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents. This time, there's 16 people firing off their chromosome card cannons. By now you know what happens. Out of 736 chromosome cards held between 16 people who lived 4 generations ago, only about 2 or 3 from each person survive to make it through time to the present to combine and make you. From there, it's a pattern you've seen. Great-grandparents, chromosome card cannons, grandparents, chromosome card cannons, and your parents, and look at the 46 chromosome cards that survive and comprise themselves to make you. From the 4th generation or your 3rd generation of grandparents, 690 chromosome cards don't make it. That's only 6% of fourth generation genetic material that survives from 4 generational transitions to make you. We are now closing in on an insight. There's something amazing that can happen as early as your 2nd generation grandparents, but which becomes likely by your 4th and 5th generation grandparents, and then inevitable by your 6th and 7th generation grandparents. You understand what's happening now and how genetic material is getting lost as we transition from one generation to another the further back we go. So this time we're going to skip a step. We're going to go from the 4th generation to the 6th generation so we can get a better look at what's really happening. When we go all the way out to 7 generations in the past, what we can call your 6th generation grandparents, we are now up to 64 people, a total of 32 couples, who between them, every single one has a baby. So there's 32 babies. These 64 people, 7 generations ago, held 2,944 chromosome cards between them. But as we've seen over and over now, only 46 chromosome cards make it to you. These genes have to find their way through the 5th generation and the 4th generation, as we've already seen. From the 6th generation, 2,898 chromosome cards are lost. If they don't find their way to another great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild, then they don't make it. They're lost. When something is a thing, it's easy to see, and it's easy to illustrate what we're talking about. But when nothing is the thing, intuition gets more tricky. This is especially so when the nothing, and not the something, is what physiologists call the mechanism of action. And spoiler alert here, that's exactly what's going on. And it's exactly why we will go back one more generation to the 7th generation in order to show the amazing role that nothing has to play in constructing the unique genome that comprises you. Okay, kids, you know the drill. Let's think about what we're looking at here. If you were born in 1992 and you're about 30 years old in 2022 when this episode was published, and if we assume every generation is an average of 25 years, well, working backwards 7 generations, that means we're going back 175 years to people who were forming their families around 1817. So in 1817, in the 7th generation backwards, there are 128 people, 64 couples, who make 64 babies. That means 5,888 chromosome cards were available from this generation being fired into the future on their chromosome cannons. Only 64 make it through time to the present to you, and that is just 0.8% that survive the time journey. 5,842 cards are lost. Having been born in 1992, you're 30 years old in 2022, but it isn't 2022. It's 1792, plus or minus 10 years. 128 women and 128 men find each other and make families. A terrible mess is made. Chromosome cards are scattered everywhere, and after all is said and done, 128 babies are born. Of your 8th generation grandparents making families between 1782 and 1802, 128 couples, or 256 people, in a stupendous dealt 11,776 chromosome cards into the future. just 46, which is about 0.4%, are able to cross through all 8 generations to unite in 1992 and form baby you. What the chromosome cards tell us is an eerie story. It's almost a ghostly story. There were people in your past, real people who lived real lives, many of them actually, who had to meet in order to produce a person, who would later meet someone else and pass genes on to you. But you carry no genes at all from some of those people who are responsible for you being you today. When we look again at the 7th generation, the phenomenon is clear. Though a few of these great-great-great-great-great-grandparents fired chromosome cards with their chromosome cannons, and they managed to make their way all the way through the generations to you now, many more of these great-great-great-great-great-grandparents can be said to have passed on only ghost chromosome cards. Their role in your personal genetic history was absolutely essential. It's totally indispensable to the outcome of making you and your unique genetic endowment at the time you were conceived. You could not be here without them. And yet, none of the genetic material they passed on survived the passage of generations to reach all the way to you in the present day, today, right now. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of the 46 card deck, as simple as a deck of cards. If you have, please hit like and subscribe. It will help me to keep generating content like this. Please join us again for part 2 of the 46 card deck, where we discover whether every European is or isn't descended from Charlemagne, and if so, or if not, then what exactly does that mean?